The Mechanics of Cognition, the Masking Burden, on the cognitive load of being hard to read and a smaller way out, by the Mercer Journal. You can do the job, you can say the right things, you can smile, laugh, respond on cue, and still walk away from an ordinary interaction more exhausted than the work itself should require. Nothing obvious went wrong, and yet something clearly did. For many people, this gets described as masking. The word is useful, but it doesn't explain the mechanism. It names the behavior without clarifying what the system is actually doing under the surface. This is not a clinical claim, but a working model of how interactional load may be structured. A more useful place to look may be ambiguity. The friction. In most interactions, people are constantly building a fast, largely unconscious read of one another. What does that tone mean? Was that comment serious or light? Is this person engaged, annoyed, reserved, distracted? These questions are usually answered through timing, expression, and pattern. When those signals are easy to interpret, the interaction feels smooth. When they are not, something else begins to happen. Masking is often described as a response to social pressure or stigma, an attempt to replicate consciously what does not happen unconsciously. But why is there still ambiguity even when one attempts to mask? Because conscious effort to meet social cues lags behind unconscious signaling. The conscious layer cannot keep pace with the unconscious layer, and it is in that gap where stigma often crystallizes. When behavior is hard to read, people fill in the gaps, and those assumptions often skew negative. This suggests that ambiguity may not be the direct cause of masking, but it helps fuel the conditions that make masking necessary. How ambiguity compounds. The pattern looks something like this. Ambiguity leads to misinterpretation, leads to stigma, leads to masking. This is one pathway, not the only one. Social pressure, group dynamics, and prior assumptions all play a role. But when others can't get a reliable read on you, they tend to hesitate. Not necessarily because they dislike you, but because they are unsure how to interpret what they are experiencing. And when you can't get a reliable read on them in return, the natural response is to compensate. You begin adjusting, managing, approximating what seems expected. You try to stabilize the interaction from your side. That compensation is what often gets called masking. But in practice, it is less about hiding who you are and more about trying to resolve ambiguity in real time. The problem is that this creates a loop. The loop. Ambiguity leads to internal prediction. Internal prediction leads to managed responses. Smiles placed deliberately, laughter used as a signal rather than a reaction, conversation shaped more by expectation than by instinct. Those managed responses can then become harder for others to read naturally. The signals are technically correct, but slightly out of phase, like a response that's almost right, but lands a fraction too late or too deliberately. The result is often more ambiguity, not less. Over time, the interaction becomes something you carry almost entirely inside your own head. You are not just responding, you are simulating. You are tracking your own expressions, anticipating their interpretation, adjusting before the moment lands. It works well enough to get through the interaction, but it comes at a cost. The cost is cognitive load. It is not simply communication. It is communication plus continuous internal management. The question then becomes whether that load can be reduced without requiring a complete shift in personality or a full abandonment of masking overnight. For many people, that is not realistic or even desirable. Some environments demand a certain level of control. Some situations are not safe for full openness. The goal here is not total unmasking. It is something smaller and more practical. A smaller shift. A possible shift is to move a small part of the interaction out of internal simulation and into explicit language. I would define it like this: signal clarification, using simple, direct language to make your internal state easier to interpret, reducing the need for continuous internal simulation. Instead of carrying the full burden of being interpreted, you introduce brief statements that give others a clearer frame for how to read you. These are not performances. They are simple orientation signals for those being interacted with. Something like, "I'm quiet at first, but I warm up," or give me a second, I process out loud, or that didn't really land for me, I tend to like dry humor more. Even a short clarification, I'm not upset, just thinking, can do more work in reducing uncertainty than a dozen managed expressions. The point is not to become more expressive, it is to become more readable. Finding the signal. For some people, the harder part is not saying these things, but knowing what to say in the first place. The internal state is there, but it isn't yet clearly formed in language. This is where something like journaling can be useful, not as a reflective exercise, but as a way of clarifying your own patterns. What tends to get misread? What do you actually mean in those moments? What kind of humor lands for you? What does quiet or processing actually look like for you in practice? The clearer this becomes internally, the easier it is to express it simply when it matters. When the ambiguity drops even slightly, the interaction changes. Others no longer have to guess as much. Their internal model of you stabilizes more quickly. And because less guesswork is happening on their side, you no longer have to compensate as heavily on yours. The loop begins to loosen. A common response to this line of thinking is, why not just tell people you're neurodivergent? In practice, that doesn't always solve the problem. Disclosure does not remove stigma if the underlying misunderstanding is still there. In some environments, it can even increase exposure to bias rather than reduce it. Conclusion. The goal then is not to treat disclosure as a universal fix. It is to improve shared understanding in smaller, more immediate ways so that when disclosure does happen, it carries less cost. This won't work everywhere. Some environments still reward performance over clarity and some people will still misread. But it can reduce how much of the interaction you are carrying. Start small, focus on one area, perhaps humor, perhaps being perceived as cold, just one area of friction at a time. The goal is not to eliminate masking in a single move. It is to reduce how much of the interaction you have to carry alone. The Mechanics of Cognition is an ongoing series looking at the mechanics behind the human mind. Feel free to subscribe for more content as it becomes available. Thanks for listening.